Speaker.
Order. I call the honourable member Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to speak on this tax bill. Tax is the price we pay to live in a decent society. Tax is how we afford to have public hospitals so that when people get sick and have heart attacks, they have some public health system that will look after them. That's why we pay our taxes. That's why we pay our taxes, so that we have a decent education system, so that our kids and all kids, wherever they're from in our country, can access decent education. And that's why it's important that we all pay our taxes, and we all pay our taxes honestly and fairly. That's why the symbols around tax are very, very important. The Minister earlier dismissed this. He said this is merely a battle about symbols. Actually, it's not just a battle about symbols, but even if it was a battle about symbols, symbols in tax matter. And the reason they matter is because if everyone thinks that everyone else is avoiding their tax, then they think it's okay to avoid their tax too. But if everyone thinks that pretty much everyone else is paying their fair share, then it's very likely that they'll pay their fair share as well. And that's what's important about the symbols around our tax system. Unfortunately, since the New Right revolution of the 1980s and the embrace of the greed is good, we've now had the development of widespread tax avoidance and a culture of widespread tax avoidance in New Zealand. We find it from the very top all the way through, but particularly amongst higher income earners. Now, Mr Speaker, the reason why I say we find it at the very top is because, of course, the banks were caught avoiding around $2 billion of tax. The High Court found that the banks had been illegally and unlawfully avoiding tax, and then eventually the banks were forced to repay around $2 billion in tax that they owed to the rest of us because they'd been unlawfully avoiding it. Of course, none of those people were prosecuted, and we've created the problem whereby tax avoidance has become widespread. There was a case recently where someone was caught avoiding their tax, and the punishment was a very large amount of tax, and the punishment was simply home detention. And of course the banks themselves didn't get any punishment whatsoever. No bank executives were put in jail or anything. So we have a problem with tax avoidance in our country, and we have a problem around the culture around tax avoidance, and that's why the gift duty issue matters so much. Aside from the content of it, it's also about the symbolism of it and about whether everyone's paying their tax. Because gift duty acts as a buttress to the tax system. That's one of its purposes. Because one of the key ways that has emerged in New Zealand to avoid paying tax is through the use of trusts. Income-generating assets have been moved into trusts so that they get taxed at the trustee rate rather than being taxed at the marginal tax rate. And gift duty effectively has acted as a dam against large amounts of assets being transferred into trusts. It meant that the asset flow going into trusts has been slowed down, and that assets can be sent into trusts at effectively $27,000 per year rather than all being gifted at once. So the gift duty rules, well, not appearing to be doing a huge amount in terms of generating tax, actually have been acting as a large dam, preventing even greater amount of assets flowing directly into the trusts and lost once and for all from view. Now, this has been of major benefit to the tax system. It's generated huge amounts of information about what's going on in terms of assets and attempts to hide income-generating assets and other assets in trusts, and that's been very useful. That's why the Green Party, from the beginning of this debate on the first reading, has opposed this particular bill because of the abolition of gift duty. And so it is, of course, we're pleased that the Labor Party has seen the light. We only wish that the National Party had seen the light to understand the significance of what they're doing. But I suspect that, unfortunately, the National Party, well, maybe they do, maybe they don't realise what they're doing. But one of the effects of this is that the dam is going to be removed. So the dam, which is currently operating to hold back large amounts of assets and to control their flow into the trust, will be removed, and a huge flow of assets will go into the trust.
Order.
And from there, they will be lost from sight to most of us, and including for IRD. Now, the reason why... Now, one of the arguments that the government puts up as to why this no longer matters is because of the equalisation of the top marginal tax rate and the trustee rate, or the equalisation of income tax rates and the trustee rate. Now, the only thing is that this isn't going to stay the same forever. So the current government has equalised these rates, but there is no guarantee that a future government might not think that New Zealand having a tax system which is wildly out of skew with most other Western countries' tax system and having a very low top marginal tax rate, I remind the House in the UK it's 50%, New Zealand won't forever have a very low top marginal tax rate. It hasn't been the case in the past, and I'm sure in the future we will have a higher marginal tax rate than we do today. At that point, there will once again open up a gap between the trustee rate and the top marginal tax rate. And it is for this reason that wealthy individuals in New Zealand will be cheering with joy when this Parliament passes this bill, because they will be free to move all of their income-generating assets into trusts in the full knowledge that were a future government to increase the top marginal tax rate again, their assets will be safe. Their assets will be safe from paying their fair share of tax in New Zealand. And in the regulatory impact statement, unfortunately, of course, IRD didn't talk about this option because it wasn't one of the options that IRD was, of course, given the responsibility to talk about, because it's talking about future policy changes with a change in government. But the reality is that this is a very real possibility in New Zealand, that in the future we will have a higher top marginal tax rate than the trustee rate. And so what this bill will do is give a lot of people who have very large assets the opportunity to hide them away in trust so that they don't get caught in the future. So it's a very sad day because it fundamentally undermines fairness in our tax system. And once you undermine fairness in the tax system, everybody thinks it's okay to avoid paying their taxes. When they see the banks avoid paying $2 billion in taxes and nobody gets punished, nobody goes to court. I mean, if you went in and stole $2 billion from the Reserve Bank illegally, would you end up, just no one gets prosecuted, nobody gets caught about it? Instead, the banks, executives and their advisors, and PricewaterhouseCoopers was in on this, they unlawfully avoided paying their tax and nobody went to court. Nobody, personally, none of the directors, none of the executives ended up in court. They all got away with it. All they had to do was pay back some of the money. So the problem is with laws like this is that you undermine the integrity of the tax system by reinforcing the idea that the tax system has one rule for the wealthy, as we're seeing tonight, a special rule for the wealthy so that they can hide their assets in trusts, and one rule for wage and salary earners, because wage and salary earners have to pay their taxes. It's very hard to avoid them. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we've opposed this bill from the beginning, because we believe that the tax system needs to be fair, it needs to appear to be fair, and while there are many good aspects about this bill, and I think there's probably cross-party support for probably the large majority of this bill, it is fundamentally undermining some of the essential fairness elements of the tax system with these changes around gift duty. And so I'd say to the Minister, symbols do matter. This bill is about more than symbols, but symbols do matter. And what the government's saying today is that just as all their other tax changes have one single direction, which is to move money towards the wealthy, this bill tonight has exactly the same direction to it. And when you look at each of the changes, whether it's the changes to the top tax rate or GST or around the gift duty tonight, each of them might be a relatively small amount, though the tax changes weren't that small and most of it went to the top decile, rather 40% of it went to the top decile. But when you put them all together, they all have the same direction of movement, and that is to move wealth towards those at the top end. And I tell you, if we keep adding to inequality in our country through the tax system and through the wages system and through every other mechanism, then we will end up with a society that we don't wish to live in. And so if you wonder why people might not be comfortable with what's going on in Aotearoa, New Zealand, look at inequality, look at what bills like this are doing to inequality, adding to inequality, which will only make it more expensive further down the track. Health, education, justice, the courts, police and crime, because inequality produces more costs on all of those things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable John Cowan.